kind of one of the founding intellectual discussions we had at Reason when we launched what we were calling the Mobility Project that Bob talked about in the plenary session was Bob Galvin, who's the one who inspired us to do this, had a very passionate feeling about what he called heresy. And he said, you know, one of the fundamental problems is most of the conversations about transportation are around improvements at the margin, and nobody's really willing to be the heretic and stand up and say, no, actually everything's got to change. and in ways that are shocking in a lot of ways. And in many ways, we haven't even gone that far. I mean, a lot of people are just completely set back on their heels by the report by David Hartgen, who's here, that we released, saying, you know, we need to build 100,000 lane miles in the next 25 years, and the concept that we actually need to build on the kind of scale of the interstate system over the next 25 years strikes a lot of people as, you know, being in that heretical vein. Though, you know, really, when you sort of break it down, it's not quite that radical. I think the real heresy at this point is just that these decisions about what to do about transportation, rather than being sort of at one extreme, being sort of the central planning vision, or I think something we're all probably more used to is if we just had a private, you know, road system based on market prices, things would be fundamentally different, which is true. But given the reality that we're closer to the right hand, or to the central planning vision than the private road vision, is what is the vision for what we need to do in the next 25 years specifically that's neither of those extremes, but is clearly heading to the left in the scale I've created. I mean, transport policy, and you get a little bit of this in Greg's talk, I mean, it's fundamentally, the reigning paradigm of transportation policy is anti-mobility, and I doubt anybody in this room is not, to some extent, aware of that. It's not at all about helping people get from here to there. It's about not helping people get from here to there. It's you quit wandering and trying to go from here to there, damn you. You're the problem, you people who want to go from here to there. And so, you know, if we wanted, well, the bottom line is marginal changes are not going to cut it. So we have to have, you know, a combination of sort of a macro heretical vision and a heretical plan for how to get there. I think we've had the heretical vision for a while with this idea of a private price-based road system, but not so much the idea of how to get there. I'm going to break this down because I don't think you guys have seen this. Though the bottom line number in various ways, Greg used 200 billion, which, you know, the slightly more conservative version of that is this 168 billion. But you know, these are all conservative estimates in the lines, and they don't include everything that should be in here. So, but it's interesting to see, you know, a lot of people aren't really cognizant of the unreliability losses, and so the breakdown is interesting. But just the attempt, the thing that kind of blows my mind is that when this came out, it's like, whoa. You know, here we've been making transportation policy, you know, in a serious way for, say, 50 years, and this is the first time someone's really tried to figure out what the real costs of congestion are, which just goes to show that the tea parties up to this point have not been about, you know, they talk CMAQ, they have hearings about CMAQ, but no one's ever actually trying to figure out how congestion matters. We're just, you know, plotting numbers we all know don't add up. Don't even come close to the real thing. So, you know, when someone actually throws something more like a realistic number out there, it's kind of revolutionary. And in some ways, that just illustrates the problem. The other thing is, because this is the first time somebody's really, you know, put a comprehensive number like that together, we don't have the time series, which would be nice, because I think if we could see what that number was in 70 and 80 and 90 and 2000, it would be even more dramatic, because it's it's not growing linearly, and with the data that we do have over time, we know that the cost of congestion is growing about double the rate of the economy. If we assume that at least partly carries over to those total numbers, and I think it's at least partly, it could even be a greater delta, you've got these costs just going at a blistering pace compared to economic growth. And that's because there's a link there. As Greg said, the mobility does actually have an effect on the economy. And so as we continue to degrade mobility, we're also undermining the economy. And one of the ways, the question that was asked of Bob that I stood up to answer in the plenary about, well, okay, if people's average commute is pretty much flat, and yet the total number of hours spent wasted in congestion keeps going up, what's the story there? And the story largely has to do with more people stuck in traffic, not. But the other part of that story that people miss is the fact that average commutes are staying the same, paints a pretty ugly picture. Because what it means is people are accepting a smaller world every year. Every year, congestion gets worse, and yet our average commutes stay the same because people are saying, well, I just got to work closer. I got to live closer. I just can't. My space in the city gets smaller every year. And Ted's done some great work on how this plays out. He talked about the response times for emergency services. That came up. How many more ambulances do you need in a metro area, even in the same geographic space, to provide appropriate coverage as congestion gets worse year after year? Well, either a lot more ambulances or a lot more people die. It's pretty straightforward. And dating. So much dating now is done through online services, and people put in there, I'm not going to date anybody more than 5 miles away because I'm not commuting to work and then fighting the evening commute over to date somebody every day. If you want to date somebody, it's a smaller and smaller circle every year. The places you can eat, the entertainment you can go to. We wonder why, one of the reasons why a lot of arts are flourishing. You can't get people to the museums, you can't get people to the opera, you can get people to rock concerts or football stadiums because getting there is horrible. And the number of people who are willing to travel the distance to that event shrinks as congestion gets worse. So there's a lot of ways in which that diminishing circle, opportunity circle, and to capture all of those things, paints a picture of what this congestion actually does. And all that's embedded in, or most of that's embedded in those costs. But the kind of the mystery part of that is actually the economic connection. Urbanized metro areas are more productive than non-metro areas. So if you take a business with 100 employees that makes widgets, and you stick it out on the edge of the metro area and kind of in the boondocks, it will have a lower productivity than if you move that into the city with the same exact people doing the same exact thing in the same exact way. Economists have tried 1,000 ways to figure out why that's true. We call it agglomeration economies, and we don't know. We have never successfully nailed down what it is. Every possible market interaction that could be driving that productivity increase we measure. Well, Edmund got part of it, but there's bars in the suburbs too, so I don't know. But there's more bars. Market interactions essentially don't answer that question. So what we say as economists now is, well, it's non-market interactions. In other words, sitting around and shooting the bull. It actually makes people more productive. And for those of you who didn't catch it, in 80 million radio shows and news stories and everything, Ed did some research for the Journal of Labor Research this year that shows that social drinkers make more money. It's the same. It's very much the same phenomenon at work here. It turns out that networking actually increases productivity. No surprise. Well, think about then how that opportunity circle plays into productivity. We could start to sort of connect the dots. We think of it as trucks sitting in traffic, lawyers or people running documents to be signed. I mean, we can come plumbers who can only now go to 5 houses instead of 8 houses. You know, we can think of a million businesses that just can't do as much business when there's more congestion. But that's the direct market effect. The other effect, which is arguably, because it's a multiplier, is arguably stronger, is this productivity effect, this agglomeration economy effect, which is if there's just fewer people you're going to be able to interact with because of congestion, because you're spending more time sitting in the car, or you just can't reach as many people, you're going to have a reduction in the agglomeration economies. And the agglomeration economies are what make cities exist. Without them, heck, we might as well be dispersed and live the good life in the country. The reason they're there is because they're more productive. And so essentially, what one thing congestion is doing is it is eliminating the economic justification for cities, which means if we just sit on our hands for the next 30, 40 years, there's not going to be an economic advantage to cities, and their economies will essentially die, and we'll have a bunch of Detroits. And anybody who's been to Detroit knows we don't want any more of that. We've sort of measured this somewhat directly. I don't know if did Bob mention the Prudhomme stuff. I can't remember, but he did. Okay, so we know there's we've starting with Remy Prudhomme's work there in France, and then it's been replicated now a couple times in different ways in the United States. We know there's this direct link. You improve people's mobility, and you get productivity increases. So in the face of that, it's very interesting to see that we've got this kind of nonsense going on. This is like the on-the-ground manifestation of what Greg talked about in the maldistribution of resources at the nationwide level. This is, okay, so these cities. Boston, about 92% of trips, 91% of trips are by automobile. 9% of their long-range transportation plan funds goes to roads. And so on down. You know, these you see, look at these ridiculous percentages. In none of these cities does more than, none of these cities does more than 10% of trips by, or less than 90% of trips by car. So this, insane maldistribution of resources. This is, you know what? Congestion is a good thing. That's what these plans represent, is an investment in worsening congestion. And, you know, it goes on.
Same like in New York, where it's almost very, very expensive even to own a car and park a car, if that's true.
No, New York is the only exception in the United States. Chicago is the next closest, and it's orders of magnitude. And the next city after Chicago is another order of magnitude down. Yeah.
The best indicator of transit market share, highway market share, is passenger miles.
Right.
New York is 9%, Chicago is 4%, and Boston is 3%.
And everything else is.
That's always.
Yeah. That's actually that's true. The miles is even more devastating. Yeah. So it's just there is a concerted decision at the local level to use that federal money and the state gas tax money and whatever local money there might be, including local sales taxes and all of this, to make congestion worse, to decrease mobility. That's the plan, essentially. Not so much in the conspiracy way that a lot of us talk about, though there is a certain amount of that going on, but more, just there's a sort of just a general philosophic basis. The fact is it's a lot easier to have a plan like this, the way the feds fund. It's a lot easier to have this plan than it is to have Atlanta's plan or Dallas's plan. They've actually had to buck the system to try to spend most of their money on roads. And, I guess I was premature, sorry. So the last thing I want to talk about real briefly is that, given all of that, I think Bob made the case pretty well that building roads is the fundamental core of how to answer that. So what I want to talk a little bit about this session is how much trickier the actual delay and congestion is than most people realize. And what this shows is that, first of all, what we think of as just too many people on the road, right? So the number of people using the road exceeds the capacity of the road, which is what we all think of as the main rush hour congestion story, is actually only about a third of the congestion story. Lousy management of the signals on the arterials is another percent, but it's 42%. Most congestion is non-recurring, meaning it's caused by things that happen at any given location and point in time, not repeated. And crash is obviously a big part of it, but they're related, right? Okay, if you've got enough capacity, then crashes don't bring everything to a grinding halt. You've got alternate routes, or you just simply have enough throughput that it slows things down, but you don't. The distribution of delay is much narrower, and the extent of the delay is much narrower. Likewise with work zones, if you've got a little more capacity, then blocking the inside lanes doesn't devastate the flow to the same extent. But one of the things you can also take away from this is that we could double the capacity in our metro areas, and that would do a lot of good things. If we manage it the way we manage our roads now, it'll all go to pot in 20 years or so. It'll be congested and poorly run. We don't manage our transportation networks as systems with flow and mobility as a performance measure of those systems. Now, we may, in some cities, we pay a token tribute to that by having a city-run or city-contracted tow truck service, that responds to call boxes on the freeway when there are accidents. In a very few places, we have, actually the state or the local government has worked with law enforcement to try to reduce the amount of time it takes to clear an accident. Embedded in this crashes is about 30% of it is the actual time it takes. There's a crash that backs things up, and the stuff getting out of there. The rest is the investigation, because the police have no incentive to keep traffic moving. They have an incentive to make sure they don't get their chops busted by anybody over did they cross their T's and dot their I's when they did the accident report. They have no incentive to do things like photograph the scene and then clear it and then do the reports, except in a few communities. In places where they've done that, it makes a huge impact. You take a 3 or 4 hour lane blockage down to 45 minutes. So there are many system management changes that are needed. Much like at the federal level, we need to change the way things are done, really, before we could probably accept a lot of the things that we would like to see happen to federal funding. If we're going to keep federal funding, it's got to be a radically different federal funding, or else we need to get rid of federal funding. It's kind of the same way. We need to build a lot of lanes, but we need to change the way capacity is managed before we build a lot of those roads, or else we're going to be flushing a lot of that money down the toilet. And so, the systematic reform of actually trying to get metro areas to run these road networks like a flow system, to be evaluated on and deemed a success in some meaningful way if they keep the roads running well. It leverages those investments in infrastructure in a way that's going to keep us from having to then double infrastructure again in the next 25 years. We have to dig ourselves out of a hole somewhat in terms of capacity, but we shouldn't have to go too far before we can achieve a lot of gains through management. And the way I think of this when we get into, Bob talked a little bit about sort of Atlanta as the first of our specific plans. In each of these cities is we need to build enough capacity to eliminate LOSF, the worst level of congestion. Better systems management can pretty much get rid of recurring LOSD and probably E and D, and most of non-recurring LOSD and E. So we should see most cities be able to operate with very rarely worse than LOSC level of service C.
Adrian,
yeah.
As the last speaker here, I'm somewhat interested in systems management, and we don't have one here. I'm very interested in what you've got to say, but in terms of the allocation of our time,
right,
and allowing time for questions at the end.
We each got 20 minutes, so
20 minutes left out of a 2-hour session
right.
down there. Do we want to extend out to 12:30, or do you want to get all into that time remaining? And if so, do we want to leave time for questions or not? I think perhaps if anybody's got any suggestions there, now's your time to say them. Otherwise, we're just going to run on until start leaving.
When we started, we only had 20 minutes each, and so we have to we need to stick to that. So, we want to have at least a few minutes at the end for questions. So my essential that was essentially my last assertion was that the as we think about transforming the funding, we think about transforming the focus on capacity, road capacity versus transit. We also need to think about transforming how these systems are managed, and that's where the private sector and the pricing of roads becomes even more crucial. I mean, sure, it's a great way to fund these roads. It's a great way to avoid all of the classic failures of government-financed and managed systems, but it is also a way to introduce, and we can see this where these privately managed toll roads exist. They run those roads radically different from government toll roads, and certainly from government-free roads. They think about these things. They think about maintenance difference, they think about management difference, they think about getting more people through the road in less time actually makes them money. So they think about how to do that, and that will start to inform the system. And we're running a city's network that way, even if it's only some elements of it are priced. But the fact that you can't have, people start to recognize, well, why aren't we running the rest of the system the way that system's being run? We start to change the management of it. We leverage those other major transport policy reforms that we've talked about. And that's it.